Hello students. Today I am going to talk about Romantic revivalism, a movement which began in the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century. This is a revival, of the romantic interest in the English poetry, with special characteristics of its own. And we will discuss these characteristics against the background of the previous era, of the Augustan age, of the neoclassical age. In the previous era, that means in the neoclassical age, the poetry had its own special interests, like poems on fashionable societies were being written, and the setting was coffee houses, theatres, courts, and especially heroic couplet was used in that era. But after the publication of Wordsworth's lyrical ballad, we note that there is a slight change in the interest of the readers, slight change in the characteristics of the poetry that came into existence. In the previous era, the poets followed some set rules, and they hardly deviated from those rules. And the rules were laid down by the classical writers. That's why the poetry written in that era was known as neoclassical poetry. So we see the poetry of the Romantic revival is in direct contrast to that of neoclassical age. In the 18th century, poetry was governed by set rules laid down by the classical writers like Horace, there were well prepared lines of poetic composition, and any deviation from those rules was frowned upon, was disliked by the critics, even by the readers, and by the teachers of poetic thoughts. The first thing that we noticed in the poetry of Romantic age is that the poets of Romantic era did not follow the rules laid down by classical writers. They broke from the slavery of the rules and regulations. The poets of the Romantic age wrote poetry in freestyle, without following any rules and regulations. Second thing that we notice in the poetry of Romantic age is that the poets now started taking interest in rural lives, in rural theme, even rural lifestyle and diction. Even Wordsworth, says in lyrical ballads that the poetry should resemble, the language of the poetry should resemble the language of the common man who lives in the streets. The poetry of the 18th century was concerned with the clubs. The poetry of the previous era, of the Restoration era, was concerned with the clubs and coffee houses and courts and drawing rooms and the social and political life of London. It was essentially the poetry of the town life. But now, in the Romantic era, after 1798, there was a major shift in the setting. Nature had practically no place earlier in the neoclassical era, neoclassical poetry. In the poetry of Romantic revival, the interests of the poets shifted from city life to country life, from coffee houses to pastures, from courts to the villages, people living in countryside, from artificial decorations of drawing rooms to the natural beauty, to the loveliness of nature. So this is the major shift in the tone and the setting of the poetry written in the Romantic period. Nature began to have its own place. Nature began to have its own importance in the poetry of Romantic age. Wordsworth was the greatest poet who revealed the physical and spiritual beauty of nature to those who were blind to the beauties of the pastures, of the hills, of the dales, of the rivers, of the streams, who were blind to any charm in the wildflowers of the green fields and the chirping birds. So this major shift was perceptible clearly. A great shift, great change in the theme, in the setting of the poetry. And this was because of the escapism of the Romantic poets. They wanted to escape from the realities of the world, from the realities of the day-to-day life, from the humdrum existence. They wanted to escape into the world of nature, into the beautiful world of nature. And they started taking interest in the lives of the common people, of the rustics, of the villagers living in the small villages. Romantic poets started taking interest in the lives of the common people, the shepherds and the cottagers, and they left the gallant lords and gay butterflies of the fashion to the care of the novelists. Now, we see a renewed interest in the village life, in the life of the country laws, in the life of a solitary reaper. A renewed interest in the simple life marked the poetry of the Romantic age. A feeling of humanitarianism colored the poetry of Wordsworth, the poetry of Shelley, or the poetry of Keats, Byron. Thus, Romantic poetry was marked by intense human sympathy and a consequent understanding of the human heart. They took more interest in the uncultivated, unrefined human beings, rustics, swans, and very simple common people.